First of all, my talk is entitled Ephemeral Space, and I should probably start with a definition of ephemeral. It actually comes from the Greek, and it has to do with space, but also time over a day. Now, that translation has actually kind of morphed into this idea of a shortened period of time or a period of space. And what's interesting is it ties together, the word ephemeral ties together both space and time. And I think that's extremely important to think about because I think as human beings, we think of space as a defined object or space that never changes over time. And in fact, the reason that I think this is such an important thing is we are actually tied to these devices. I think over the last decade, our space has changed, and we're so tied to this device that we forget that there are other spaces that we encounter every day. The other thing that I think is really interesting is space changes constantly. As I look out at the audience, I'm watching the way that people are sitting. If you're sitting next to someone you probably don't know, you probably subconsciously changed your elbow situation so that you're not brushing up against that person, right? And so the other thing is if you're familiar with a person, you may be sitting next to that person and your elbows might be touching. But if you don't know that person, you subconsciously change that space to modify it so that you're not touching that other person. The same thing goes on a plane, of course. The other thing that's really interesting is this space changes. So today, for instance, it is me against the audience, right? So there is a space between the audience and myself that's very interesting and compelling. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that relationship also in a little while. But first, I want to talk about my background. I actually grew up in a very small town called Britain, Michigan. It had 500 people, small little village. And what was interesting about that, if you look up at the satellite view, is you can see that it's farmland. Now, the reason it's farmland is because Lake Erie used to come up to that village, and in fact, past the village. And there is a road called Ridge Road that still exists. And if you go to Ridge Road, you can look out over the landscape, and you can see it's extremely flat because it was the bed of Lake Erie for a long time. So that's really compelling. The other thing I want to instill in you is this idea that we, as human beings, love to demarcate things. In order for us to understand space, what happened was Jefferson brought this idea of a grid that would go across the country, right? So as a result of that, if you look at the slide, you can see these patches of land. Now, those patches of land for agriculture only exist because someone decided to demarcate certain kind of properties, right? So it's very interesting. Also, the other thing that's interesting about this is that space constantly changes. And I'm not a bird, so I never experience this particular landscape. In fact, when I looked out my window as a child, that landscape would constantly change. One year there might be soybeans, and I could actually see 30 miles down to Lake Erie out my bedroom window. And at other times, it was planted with corn. I might be able to see 30 feet outside of my window. So again, there is this huge relationship between time and the way that we experience that space, and that constantly changes. And I think it's incredibly important that we think about those things, because as our population grows in the United States and in the world, we are changing that land by default. We are beginning to occupy that in very different ways. And the thing that we have to think about is we can't just think about our relationship to our iPhones anymore. We have to think about our relationship to the larger geography. And one thing I would, this is a picture of, the other thing is I know something about both those broad spaces as I looked out my bedroom window, and I know something about really, really tiny spaces, because this is a photograph of my brother and me when we were children. I grew up in a family with 2 sets of twins, which was very odd in a village of 500. And so unfortunately we couldn't get away with anything because everyone knew who we were. So that was rather interesting. But also it was, I shared a very tight space for a while with a brother. So I'm interested in both kind of the expansiveness of space and then the very tight spaces. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is continuous space, because we often think that space is defined, when in fact space is actually continuous in many ways. So this object is actually called a Mobius strip. So I have a little demonstration to show you. I'm going to take a piece of paper. This strip of paper has two sides, right? Correct? Correct. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fold that and connect that together with a piece of tape. Hopefully. And once I've connected that space, I actually have space which actually connects to itself. And I'm going to prove that to you in a very simple way. I'm going to take this Sharpie, and I'm going to start drawing on this strip. I'm never going to lift the pen from the paper. And what I ended up doing is I never lifted that pen, but yet I drew on both sides of that paper. So it's kind of mind-blowing to think that actually space can kind of move in that sort of way. So that's a very interesting two-dimensional idea about space. And this is a Klein bottle, which is another interesting idea about space. It's actually a Mobius strip that's then in 3 dimensions. So the surface of that volume actually becomes the interior of that volume, theoretically. So it's also very interesting because we often think of space as something that is clearly defined, when in fact, space is continuously moving. The Earth, as it rotates around the sun, you imagine that that orbit continues around the same orbit and that it continues through the same space. And yet, what actually happens is, as the universe expands, that orbit is never in the same place, ever. So the Earth is never in the same place at the same time when it's actually moving around the sun. And that's kind of mind-blowing as well to think that there is this expansion. And so space is much more kind of broad than we generally think. The other thing I'm interested in is kind of small space. And so the other thing I began becoming interested in is this idea of the fist. Which has a couple connotations. If I make a fist, it can be very aggressive, right? But it can also be very polite. So if I fist bump a friend, that's something very different, right? So that space can have different kind of meanings and connotations. So I was actually at a residency this summer, and I decided to do something and manifest my fist, or the space between my fists, as something kind of interesting and something solid. So I began to make a series of these fists with porcelain. And I made 1,000 of these things. And so basically they solidified into this very interesting vertebrae-shaped object. And then I decided to then accumulate those 1,000 fists and make yet another form. So what I think is interesting and compelling about this is I've taken a space that's very small, I've actually solidified it into something, and then I've recreated yet another space involving that particular object. And so that's the kind of malleability of space that I think is rather interesting and kind of flows throughout my work. Large spaces. This is a photograph I took in South Dakota last winter. I was amazed by kind of the expansiveness of space in South Dakota. What's interesting about this was a cornfield, and some of the stubble had been left, right? And so the simple line begins to define a space within that field. That lasts only during the winter. I went by the other day, and that is now a soybean field, and so the space is very, very different and feels very different than it did last winter. I also love the fact that in South Dakota, people love to ice fish. It's an incredible idea. You can't really occupy the water except in a boat during the summer, and yet these whole communities begin to take place on the ice during the winter. And to me, that was really fascinating, this idea about this kind of surface that solidifies. It solidifies enough that it can be occupiable, and that begins to form a series of communities on that. Well, so I was also interested in the fact that lying underneath that ice is also water still. And so what I did is I actually learned how to use an ice saw last winter, and I began to cut into the surface of the ice. And so I made this particular image last winter. And what I like about it is that even though there is this kind of ice as a threshold, I'm really connecting between the water and the sky simultaneously. And so I think we as humans love to make marks in the land. And this is a very simple mark which begins to make a space in a certain way, but it also begins to connect two very different worlds, that of the water and that of the sky. And as a kind of result of that, 2 days later, there was a huge storm. And what I hadn't anticipated is that that surface would then kind of ice over as a kind of scar or remnant of that act of cutting through the ice. And to me, the stuff that I do has to do with kind of changing a space, changing our ideas of the space, changing the way that we react to space, and really seeing how the phenomenology then begins to affect those spaces. And so last year, I also talked to a local farmer. This is a corn crib. The reason I loved corn cribs is I used to play with them as a child. They were wonderful spaces, really intriguing spaces. They're both translucent, transparent, and yet begin to form space as well. And so what I did last year is I talked to a local farmer and I said, hey, do you mind if I kind of alter your corn crib? And he's like, what do you want to do exactly? And I said, well, I mean, it sounds kind of odd, but I want to put mylar strips on it. He said, I don't know what you're doing, but sure, go ahead and try it. So it was really, really pretty amazing. And I figured out a way to kind of put those mylar strips on there. And what happened was, this is that same corn crib probably 2 or 3 months later. So I don't know if you guys know it, but South Dakota has a lot of wind. And so what I was interested in is how this space would begin to transform over time. And so here is a video of that corn crib. And you can see what's interesting about it is the dimensions of that corn crib actually change minute by minute, depending on the wind. So it actually adds volume to that over time. This thing became kind of an icon for the city. It was placed in Volga. And it became a really interesting kind of idea about how do you experience space? How do you have these kind of markers along the land that can tell you something about the land? And then this is a project I did in Montauk this past summer at the Albee Foundation. This is a rectangle of sea salt. And what I was interested in is how can I very simply make space in a very, very simple way? And by going that morning, putting this salt in, I actually defined a space. And also what happened was the sea came and reclaimed the salt. And so I really like this idea of this phenomena of changing space in a very short period of time or in a longer period of time, etc. And then since that time, I've been thinking about space in a very different way. I've been thinking about how you can minimally make space, how simple it is to make space. So as a participant in this TED Talk, I was basically told I needed to stay on this little red carpet underneath this light, which of course the first thing I wanted to do was actually step out of that light. So what's interesting is I'm no longer in that space. That space is defined by a simple, circle of red and the light coming down through there. So I got to thinking about how can light begin to define space or territory in a certain way. So this is the final slide. It is an image of a new project I have out in Castlewood, South Dakota. Again, I love the corn crib. And so I found this vestigial corn crib, and I decided to add strips of LED lights to it. It's powered by solar power, so it stands on its own. It's self-sustaining. But what I think is interesting about it is it raises a lot of questions about space. Number one is, why is that there, first of all? Why would someone do that, second of all? And what does it actually mean? And I have to tell you a little story. Immediately after this was lit, someone came by in a truck and he stopped and he said, "Oh my God, is Ted dead?" And I was like, so Ted is the farmer who owns this corn crib? And so it seemed very odd to me that someone thought, oh, because this was lit, there's some kind of a eulogy to Ted. And I had to reassure him Ted was very much alive. But it's interesting to me how people begin to interpret space and interpret these kind of installations that I do. So really the takeaway for this talk is, as we begin to build and think about our population growing, we have to think seriously about the spaces we're creating. And we have to be inventive about the way that we make space. It doesn't necessarily have to be clearly defined. It's something as simple as time mixed with space, and perhaps lighting or some other kind of mechanism that allows us to kind of occupy those spaces in different time frames. And so I think as the world population continues to grow, we have to really step back from our iPhones or our digital devices and really participate in the creation of spaces that are meaningful. Thank you.